Hi guys, we're going to be moving on to lesson 13 today. We're going to be talking about comparing settings. We've been learning that good readers use outside texts to help them gather important information about the setting. So remember, we're focusing on Alaska and specifically the Yukon Territory. So that's where that is on the map. And we live right about here, so you can see. I'm going to teach you that good readers compare their own lives to the lives of the characters in the book. Doing this helps readers understand how the time and place we live impacts our lives. And so then the time and place that our characters live in impacted their lives. When reading an anthology, remember, you don't need to read the chapters in order because each chapter is a story. Okay, each story can be read on its own independently and it's still going to make sense. Because remember, an anthology is a collection of stories inside of a book. So today we're going to start off with chapter 4. Okay. As I read, pay attention to how the children of the gold rush lived unique lives and how they're different from ours. So as I'm reading, we're going to create a list to keep track of the differences between the Yukon Territory and our lives in Massachusetts, our typical lives, not during shutdown. And as I'm doing that, you can look at these talking frames. You can use them in your head to help you. So I am thinking the Gold Rush children lived in a unique place and time because blank. This is different from my own life because blank, and this helps me understand blank. Okay, and then we'll look at the list. Okay, so chapter 4, Robert Farnsworth, Army Post on the Yukon. Looks like. On December 31st, 1899, an ice storm filled the air with millions of crystals. Northern lights danced in the sky overhead. It was 70 degrees below zero in Tanana, Alaska, but 11-year-old Robert Farnsworth stood outside to admire the sight. He wore a full suit of fur clothing made by local native women to keep him warm. Later, he would write about that night. The aurora borealis hung in the skies like washing on a line, waving around. Robert had mushed his own dog team and made friends with the Athabascan chief named Chief Joseph. Sometimes he and his father went caribou hunting on snowshoes with the native people. Once they found a herd of more than 1,000 caribou and shot 36 of them. There was enough meat to feed the whole town and post throughout the winter. Robert's arrival in Alaska 6 months earlier, already like a distant memory. A scared 10-year-old, he had come north by ship with his stepmother and father. His natural mother had died when he was a baby. His father was the lieutenant commander of the U.S. Army, Company E, which had just been assigned to Alaska because of the Klondike Gold Rush. And this is a picture of Robert with his dogs. Says Robert feeding, the caption for this picture says Robert feeding his dogs on the Army Post Fort Egbert at Eagle. Because of the Klondike Gold Rush, the North had become a wild place with lots of claim jumping, robberies, and even murders. The Army hoped that a military post on the Yukon River would help maintain order. When they arrived at St. Michael, Alaska in July 1899, it was 11 o'clock at night. But the sun was still high in the sky, so Robert refused to go to bed. His parents tried to tell him about the midnight sun and how it did not set during the summer, but Robert wouldn't listen. He stayed up all night, just like the Inuit Eskimo children he met there who played at night and slept during the day. Soon, the family and the soldiers traveled up to the village of Tanana, where the Tanana River joins the Yukon. There, the soldiers constructed Fort Gibson. Robert was the only child at the fort. Because there was no school there, his mother taught him lessons. After a long winter, the first boat to come upriver in May brought fresh fruit and mail. Sadly, Robert learned that his grandfather had died in January. But fortunately, another family, including several children, arrived on a boat. Robert threw his arms around the oldest boy, who instantly gave him a black eye. The family had brought along the first funny paper he had ever seen. Funny papers are like comics. Robert recovered his pride by reading Katzenjammer Kids over and over, laughing and crying at their antics. Orders also arrived from Washington. The Farnsworth and Company E were transferred to Fort Egbert at Eagle. Eagle was a small settlement, not far from the Canadian border and only 100 miles downriver from the boom town of Dawson. But Robert never managed to visit Dawson because his mother was considered it too wild for a young boy. With its barracks for 102 enlisted men, a gymnasium, baseball fields, a library of 1,200 books, and a large stable for horses and mules, Fort Egbert was much larger than Fort Gibson. Robert enjoyed his new home and many new activities. One of his father's responsibilities was to supervise the construction of a telegraph line to connect Eagle with the rest of the world. Then there would be no more waiting for news from outside. In addition, Robert and some townspeople helped his father collect specimens of birds and bears for the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. years later. Robert would proudly see them on display there. When ice breakup came in June, Farnsworth was reassigned to Fort Vancouver in Washington. The family sadly left Fort Egbert. Robert had grown out of all of his clothing, so his mother cut him a pair of pants out of an old army blanket. He also wore a pair of his mother's old shoes with the heels cut off and an old shabby coat. When the family reached Seattle, they were in such awful sight that the taxi cab driver refused to take them unless they paid in advance. He didn't believe that they had any money because they looked so disheveled. Robert never again lived in Alaska, but his father and mother returned for another tour of duty in 1910. After his father died, Robert donated his father's Alaskan papers and photographs to the University of Alaska Fairbanks archives. Later, he wrote a manuscript about his adventures in the North County and interesting people he had met. All right, so there's at the end of this chapter, there's a lot of really cool things. Where was it? Oh, this picture right here is of the Farnsworth family. That was Robert's family. Here were the dogs that he mushed at the bottom. Okay, so let's look at the list that we created here for the Yukon Territory versus Massachusetts on a typical day. So in the Yukon Territory, they wore fur coats. Here we might wear a windbreaker, a raincoat, maybe still your winter coat. It's still a little chilly. The temperatures there were 70 degrees below zero in the winter. And we have winters that are sometimes below freezing, but typically it's not that cold. Definitely not 70 below. They have Aurora Borealis there. We don't have that. Remember, that's the light show in the sky. They hunted for caribou for food, whereas we go grocery shopping. They wore snowshoes, which is a shoe with kind of like, it looks like a tennis racket stuck to the bottom to help you stay above the snow, where we probably wear sneakers, and in the summer we wear sandals. It was a wild place of crime because they didn't have police at first, and we have laws and police. In the summer, the sun doesn't set there, whereas here the sun does set. There was no mail delivered in the winter because it was so dangerous and icy, where mail is delivered here year-round. They didn't have any phones. Remember, they were setting up a telegraph there, but we have cell phones and emails that are regular forms of communication. They were very isolated there. So today and every day you read, I want you to compare the circumstances of the characters to those of your own life in order to understand how lives are impacted by where and when we live. Okay. For your discussion question today, I want you to post a comment with, what would be the most challenging thing for you to have to face in the Yukon Territory in 1897? Okay, so think about the list that we just came up with there. What would be the most challenging thing for you? Okay, thanks guys, bye.